She was older, beautiful in a quiet way, and carried a grief that lingered in every room she entered. I never meant to get close, but night after night, I found myself at her door. And the night she whispered, "Your visits are my favorite bad habit," everything between us changed. There's something about a single light left burning in the quiet of night. It doesn't shout for attention, but it lingers like a secret, pulling your eyes toward it when everything else has gone dark. For weeks, I noticed the glow from my neighbor's house, the widow who lived alone 2 doors down. Her porch light was always on. Sometimes it was the soft, golden lamp by her front window, sometimes just the steady glow over the steps. I told myself I didn't think much of it, but the truth is I noticed. I always noticed. She was in her early 40s, I guessed. Graceful in the way she carried herself, though you could tell she bore a heaviness that didn't leave easily. I had only spoken to her a handful of times, a polite wave when we crossed paths, the occasional exchange about weather or mail. But the light in her window made me wonder. Did she leave it on because she was afraid of the dark? Or because it was easier than sitting in silence? One evening, I found myself walking past her house a little slower than usual. She was on the porch, setting down a grocery bag, and I offered the kind of neighborly smile you give without thinking. She smiled back, polite, practiced, but her hands fumbled with the bag as if it was heavier than she'd expected. I crossed the street before my brain could overthink it. "Here, let me help you," I said, reaching for the second bag before she could object. She hesitated, then let me take it, her eyes softening with a mix of relief and apology. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice had that low, steady warmth that makes you lean closer without realizing. Inside her house, I noticed the little details that hinted at her life. A vase of flowers just beginning to wilt. A bookshelf lined with novels, their spines bent with use. A framed photograph turned slightly away on the mantel, as if it had been shifted in a moment of absent-mindedness. She moved with quiet efficiency, putting away cans and jars, but her silence wasn't cold. It was the kind that comes from someone used to living with their own thoughts. "You're kind to help," she said finally, her back still turned. "It's nothing," I answered. "I walk past here most nights anyway." When she turned to face me, there was something in her eyes I couldn't place. Not quite sadness, not quite gratitude, maybe a little of both. It was the look of someone who hadn't had company in a while, but wasn't sure if she should ask for it. After that, I started noticing more. The way she left her curtains open just enough that the glow spilled onto the street. The sound of her kettle sometimes whistling when I walked by. The faint scent of jasmine tea drifting out her kitchen window on cool nights. I never knocked without reason. Sometimes it was groceries, sometimes a package left at her door. Once, I offered to fix the loose hinge on her gate. Each time, she let me in with that same polite smile, but slowly, I began to see it soften into something warmer, less guarded. There was a stillness in her home that felt different from mine. My apartment carried the restless noise of someone still figuring out his place in the world. Her house carried silence, but not emptiness. It was the silence of memories, of laughter that once filled the rooms but no longer did. I didn't know what I was looking for, not really. But I knew this: her light was always on, and some part of me kept walking toward it. That's how it began, not with a grand confession, not with a sudden spark, but with a quiet porch light, and a young man who couldn't help but notice. It happened on a night when the air carried that early autumn crispness, cool enough that you could see your breath if you lingered outside. I had stopped by her porch, returning a package the delivery man had mistakenly left at my door. When she opened it, the warm glow spilled out behind her, wrapping me in the scent of something faintly sweet, jasmine, maybe, or chamomile. She glanced at the box in my hands, then at me. "I owe you one," she said softly. Then, after the briefest hesitation, "Would you like some tea? Just to warm up." Her voice carried that same quiet steadiness I'd noticed before, but this time it had an undercurrent, as if she was asking more than she wanted to admit. I stepped inside, careful not to overstay the welcome, though a part of me wanted to believe she meant the invitation. The house was as I remembered, Books neatly stacked, the faint hum of a clock, silence that felt less empty tonight and more expectant. She busied herself in the kitchen, filling the kettle with a practiced hand. I could hear the soft clink of porcelain cups being set on a tray. For a moment, I just stood there by the window, looking out at the quiet street, my reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. Behind me, the kettle began to whistle. "Sit," she said, appearing with 2 mugs balanced carefully. "I don't get much company, so forgive the dust on the corners." I smiled, shaking my head. "Feels lived in. That's better than perfect." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but something that carried warmth all the same. We settled by the window, the two of us facing the dark street beyond. The curtains were pulled just enough that the glow from the lamp framed us in a kind of cocoon. The first sip of tea was hot, fragrant, grounding. She cradled her cup with both hands, shoulders slightly curved inward as though the warmth was something she wanted to hold on to longer. At first, our words circled safe topics: the neighborhood, the unreliable mail, the weather. But little by little, she let the conversation drift further. She told me she had lived in the house for over a decade. That her late husband had planted the rose bush by the porch. That some nights she still swore she could hear him moving through the halls. Her voice didn't crack when she said it, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the way she stared down into her cup as though it could anchor her. I wanted to say something that could make her feel less alone. But what do you offer to someone who's already lost the thing they cherished most? Instead, I just listened, letting her words hang in the warm stillness between us. When she turned the question back to me, I spoke more than I usually did. I admitted how adrift I sometimes felt, how at my age, everyone seemed to be racing ahead, chasing jobs and relationships, while I was still figuring out what I wanted to hold on to. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady, the kind that made you believe your words mattered. There was a comfort in the rhythm of it, the quiet sip, the shared glance, the pauses where nothing needed to be filled. At one point, her hand brushed mine as she reached for the sugar bowl. A small thing, really? But my breath caught in the space of that touch, as if the silence itself had shifted. Her eyes lingered on mine just long enough for me to wonder if she'd felt it too. Then she looked away, stirring her tea with a soft clink of the spoon. The night stretched, unhurried, until the clock's hands crept past midnight. When I finally rose to leave, she walked me to the door, standing close enough that I caught the faint scent of her perfume, light, floral, like something carried on a breeze. "Thank you for the company," she said, her voice quieter than before. I wanted to tell her I should be thanking her, for letting me see past the polite smile, for letting me into her silence. But all I managed was, "Any time." As I stepped back into the cool night, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't just neighborly kindness anymore. It was the beginning of something unspoken, fragile, unacknowledged, but real. It was a passing moment, one that might have slipped by unnoticed if not for the way her words lodged themselves deep in my chest. By then, my visits had become a rhythm neither of us named. Some evenings it was just a brief exchange on her porch, a return dish, a shared comment about the weather. Other nights, she would invite me in, and we would talk over tea, letting the clock drift unnoticed past midnight. It wasn't every day, but it was often enough that her house no longer felt like a stranger's. The silence between us was no longer awkward, it had become something steady, something that carried its own quiet comfort. That night had started like any other. I had stopped by after a long day, and she answered the door in a soft cardigan, her hair loosely tied back as though she hadn't expected company but didn't mind it either. The air inside was warm, touched with the faint spice of cinnamon from something she must have baked earlier. We ended up in the kitchen, talking about nothing, about a recipe she'd been trying, about how unreliable the postman had become. I was leaning against the counter, half laughing at a joke she made about neighborhood gossip, when she said it. "Your visits," she said lightly, almost as if to herself, "are becoming my favorite bad habit." She didn't look at me when she said it. Her focus was on rinsing a teacup, her movements casual, but her voice carried something beneath the humor, a tremor, a weight she hadn't meant to reveal. For a heartbeat, I didn't respond. My chest tightened, and the air felt different, charged in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if all the quiet evenings, all the soft conversations and lingering glances, had suddenly been named without either of us deciding to. I managed a chuckle, the safe response. Well, I can think of worse habits. She glanced at me then, her eyes holding mine for a fraction longer than usual. There was a smile on her lips, yes, but her expression carried something else, something unspoken, something she wasn't sure she should have said out loud. The moment passed quickly. She dried the cup, set it down, and changed the subject with a practiced ease. But my mind stayed caught on those words, replaying them long after we'd moved on to lighter topics. Later, when I left, the night air felt cooler than usual. I walked home with my hands in my pockets, her voice echoing in my head, my favorite bad habit. It wasn't just what she'd said, but how she'd said it, the blend of playfulness and truth, as if she was confessing and hiding at the same time. I couldn't stop wondering, did she regret saying it? Was it a slip, or was it intentional? The days after, I noticed a shift. She still welcomed me, still offered tea, still laughed at small jokes. But there was a new caution in her eyes, a subtle hesitation before she let me in. Her smiles lingered, but so did her silences. It was as if she had revealed more than she meant to, and now she was trying to tuck it back away. For my part, I pretended not to notice. But inside, something had changed. Her words had cracked open a door I hadn't dared to push against before. I had always told myself I was just being kind, just being neighborly. But that night, with that simple confession, I realized I was no longer sure if kindness was the whole truth. I found myself listening more closely when she spoke, watching the curve of her smile, the way her hand brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Every gesture seemed to carry new meaning. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. But between us, the air was different now. The question was no longer whether there was something more, it was whether either of us would admit it again. It's strange how silence feels different when you know what it's hiding. For a while, after her quiet confession, things seemed unchanged on the surface. I still walked past her house in the evenings, still caught the warm glow spilling from her windows. Sometimes she waved, sometimes she didn't. But slowly, I began to notice what was missing. The porch light, once so reliable, stayed dark more often than not. The curtains, once drawn just enough for me to glimpse the lamp inside, were now pulled shut. It was as though she had taken a step back into the shadows, and I wasn't sure whether I should follow. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. People get busy, after all. Maybe she needed time to herself. But the absence pressed heavier each night I walked past, and the silence between us began to feel intentional. One evening, after nearly a week of that quiet distance, I stopped at her gate anyway. The hinge I had fixed creaked faintly when I touched it, a reminder of the small ways I had made myself part of her world. I hesitated, debating whether to knock, whether my presence would be welcome. My heart thudded like I was intruding on something sacred. But finally, I lifted my hand and knocked gently. It took longer than usual for the door to open. When it did, she stood there with her arms folded across her chest, cardigan pulled tightly around her, as though she were bracing against more than the evening chill. "Hi," I said softly, trying to keep my voice from carrying too much weight. I just wanted to check in. I hadn't seen your light on." Her eyes softened for a moment, then she looked down, shaking her head slightly. "I didn't want to bother you anymore." The words stung more than I expected. "You never bothered me," I said quickly. "Not once." She stepped back, letting me in with a sigh, though her movements were slower than usual. Inside, the house felt colder somehow, as if she tried to seal it off from company. We stood in the living room, the air thick with everything unsaid. She avoided my eyes, fussing with a magazine on the table that didn't need straightening. Finally, she spoke. "I shouldn't have said what I did the other night." I knew what she meant before she even explained. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "You mean about my visits being your favorite bad habit?" Her face flushed slightly. She nodded. It was careless. People would talk if they knew how often you were here. You're younger. I'm. She broke off, the word she avoided hanging there anyway. Older. A widow. Someone who wasn't supposed to let herself want more. I took a slow breath. Do you really care what people think? Her eyes finally met mine, full of conflict. Don't you? You have your whole life ahead of you. And me. Her voice faltered, softer now. I've already lived mine in some ways. The silence after that was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't saying, the pull between us, the fear of what it meant, the awareness that the world outside might not understand. I stepped closer, careful not to cross the invisible line she'd drawn. I don't care what it looks like, I said. I care about what it feels like. And being here, with you, it feels right. Her shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension easing though not disappearing. She looked at me as though she wanted to believe me, but wasn't sure she could trust herself to. We didn't resolve it that night. There was no sudden embrace, no easy answer. Just two people standing in the quiet, both afraid of the same thing but unwilling to let go of what was pulling them together. As I left, she lingered by the door, watching me walk down the steps. And though she didn't say it, I felt the weight of her silence. It was the silence of someone who wanted to close the distance, but didn't yet know how. The evening the rain came, it arrived suddenly, drumming against rooftops and spilling down the gutters like it had been holding itself back for weeks. I remember jogging up the street, soaked through in seconds, when I noticed her in the yard. She was struggling to pull down the laundry from the line, clothes whipping in the wind, her cardigan clinging wet to her shoulders. I didn't even think. I ran straight through the puddles and into her yard, calling out her name. She startled, then laughed breathlessly when she saw me, strands of wet hair plastered to her face. Of all nights, she muttered, clutching at a bedsheet that nearly tore free. Here, let me. I stepped in beside her, grabbing the other end. Our hands brushed, slick with rain, and for a moment the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm in my chest. Together we wrestled the clothes free, bundling them into our arms. By the time we dashed inside, dripping water onto the floorboards, we were both out of breath and laughing like children who'd run from trouble. The laughter faded as quickly as it came, though. The sound of the rain filled the silence, pounding against the roof as if it wanted to remind us how close we were standing. She dropped the damp sheets onto a chair and pushed back her wet hair, her cheeks flushed, her lips parted just slightly as she caught her breath. I stood there watching her, and something inside me shifted. It wasn't just admiration or affection anymore, it was need. A quiet, aching need I wasn't sure I had any right to feel. She noticed me staring. I could see it in the way her laughter softened into a nervous smile, in the way she folded her arms as though trying to shield herself from more than just the chill. You're soaked, she said, her voice low. You'll catch cold. So are you, I replied. For a long beat, either of us moved. The rain hammered down, the lights flickered, and still we stood in that charged silence. Every detail seemed magnified, the droplets clinging to her lashes, the faint tremor of her breath, the warmth radiating from her even through the damp clothes. Then, without deciding to, I stepped closer. Just close enough that I could smell her perfume faintly beneath the rain, just close enough that my sleeve brushed against her arm. She froze, but she didn't move away. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in them I saw the battle she was fighting, the same one I was. Want against restraint. Desire against fear. Her hand shifted slightly, almost brushing mine on the chair where I leaned. I felt the ghost of her touch, my skin tingling as though she'd already reached for me. But then she drew back, her breath catching as if the weight of the moment was too much. She shook her head, whispering, "We shouldn't." The words stung, but they weren't rejection. They were a confession. I swallowed hard, forcing a steady voice. I know. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, fragile. I knew if I leaned just an inch closer, everything would change. But I didn't. I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I picked up one of the damp sheets and gave a crooked smile. We should probably hang these somewhere before they mildew. Her laugh returned, softer this time, trembling at the edges. And when she reached for the other side of the sheet, her fingers brushed mine again. Only this time, the touch lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. The rain kept falling, but in that small, dimly lit room, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us, caught in the space between restraint and surrender. The night everything shifted was one of those evenings where the air carried a restless weight. A storm had passed earlier, leaving the streets damp, the scent of wet earth lingering. I found myself on her porch again, though I hadn't planned it. My feet just led me there, as though her house had become the only place that made sense when the world felt too loud. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting. Her cardigan hung loosely from her shoulders, her hair down in a way I rarely saw, and the warm glow behind her framed her like a painting. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. "You're out late," she finally murmured. "So are you." That made her smile faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She stepped aside, and I entered, the familiar quiet wrapping around me. The kettle was already on, whistling softly, like part of a ritual we'd fallen into without meaning to. We sat in the living room, mugs in hand, the rain still dripping steadily outside. I don't remember what we talked about at first, small things, trivial things, but beneath every word was a current pulling us somewhere deeper. At one point, she laughed at something I said, a soft, genuine laugh that lit up her face. The sound undid me. I watched her, unable to look away, and she must have felt it because her laughter faded, replaced by that nervous stillness I had come to recognize. "Don't look at me like that," she whispered. "Like what?" "Like you want something you shouldn't." Her words trembled, though her eyes held mine. I set my mug down slowly, leaning forward. "What if I can't help it?" Her breath hitched. She set her own cup aside, her hands tightening in her lap. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world balanced on the edge of her answer. "You're too young," she said finally, her voice breaking. "And you're you," I interrupted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "And that's all I see." The silence that followed was unbearable. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, pressing against the windows, echoing the pounding in my chest. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes shimmering with a mix of fear, longing, and something dangerously close to surrender. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us. But suddenly I was closer, close enough to feel the warmth of her knee against mine, close enough to notice the faint tremble in her hands. Her fingers twitched as though she wanted to reach out but couldn't bring herself to. I wanted to take her hand, to end the hesitation, but I stayed still, giving her the choice. "Don't," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. It was a plea, not a command. "Tell me you don't feel it too," I said softly. Her eyes closed, her breath shaky. When she opened them again, I already knew the answer. She didn't speak it, she didn't have to. It was there, written in the way her gaze lingered on my mouth, in the way she leaned ever so slightly toward me before catching herself and pulling back. The breaking point wasn't a kiss. It wasn't an embrace. It was that half moment, that fragile space where we almost gave in but didn't. Where the truth stood naked between us, undeniable, irreversible. She rose quickly, as though standing might save her from the pull between us. "You should go," she said, her voice firmer now, though her hands betrayed her by trembling against her sides. I stood too, my chest tight, my heart aching with everything left unsaid. I nodded because pressing her then would have broken something fragile we hadn't even fully built. But as I stepped out onto the porch, the rain misting cool against my face, she followed me to the doorway. Her voice was softer then, almost tender. "You don't know what you're doing to me." I turned, meeting her eyes one last time that night. "I think I do." The door closed gently between us, but it didn't matter. The line had been crossed. We were already too far gone. The days after that night felt different. Even when I wasn't at her house, I carried the weight of what had almost happened, the closeness, the confession neither of us dared to fully give voice to. Every ordinary task felt sharper, like the world was waiting for me to acknowledge the truth that had been quietly growing between us all along. I avoided her porch for a few nights, not out of disinterest, but because I was afraid of what might happen if I went back too soon. But the distance only made me restless. Her absence was louder than her presence, echoing in my chest until I couldn't take it anymore. On the fourth night, I found myself walking down her street again. Her light was on, just as it always was, glowing steady through the window. My pulse quickened at the sight of it. That light had always been a beacon, the first thread that had pulled me toward her. I knocked softly, and when she opened the door, her expression was unreadable. Relief, fear, something tender she tried to mask. "You came back," she said quietly. "I couldn't stay away." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. The air inside carried the familiar scent of jasmine tea and rain-damp wood. We didn't go to the kitchen this time. Instead, she led me to the living room, where the lamplight pooled in soft gold across the carpet. For a long while, we didn't speak. She sat on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, while I lingered by the window, trying to steady myself. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was waiting. Finally, she broke it. "We can't keep circling this." My throat felt dry. "I know." Her eyes lifted to mine, wide and uncertain. "You deserve someone who can give you all the things I can't. Someone without the history, the scars." I shook my head, stepping closer. "I don't care about any of that. I don't want someone else. I want you." Her breath caught, her fingers tightening together. For a moment, I thought she'd tell me to leave again. But then she exhaled, slowly, like she was letting go of a burden she'd carried too long. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've spent years building walls just to keep from falling apart. And every time you walk through that door, you tear them down without even trying." I knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in mine. They trembled, but she didn't pull away. "Then let me help you carry what's behind them." Her eyes shimmered, and I felt her walls crack right there between us. She squeezed my hands back, her touch lingering, full of the fear and longing she had tried so hard to hide. For the first time, she didn't step away. She leaned forward instead, her forehead resting against mine, her breath warm and uneven. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was closer than anything we'd dared before. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I whispered. "But maybe that's how we know it matters." The silence after that felt different, no longer heavy, but gentle, like the calm after a storm. She finally smiled, small but real, her thumb brushing lightly across my knuckles. When I left that night, there were no dramatic goodbyes, no promises carved into stone. But the way she lingered in the doorway, the way her hand slid against mine one last time before letting go, it told me everything. Her light was still burning as I walked home, steady and unwavering. For the first time, I realized it wasn't just a habit of hers. It was a signal, not just for safety, but for connection. For me. And though we hadn't named it out loud, though the future was uncertain, I knew this much: I was no longer just a passerby drawn to a window's glow. I was part of her life now, and she was part of mine. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. 27L